One of the most prominent and significant symbols of the French Revolution was the guillotine. It was the execution device which was used to take the heads of thousands of people who were believed to be dissenting towards the revolution at a period of time which was known as the Reign of Terror. It would also take the heads of the king and queen, but the guillotine took inspiration from beheading devices which had been around for centuries. The French were looking for an execution device which could quickly take the life of a condemned person, and they wanted a more clinical execution method when compared to what they had before, such as a breaking wheel, which was often very barbaric. But one of the biggest inspirations for the French guillotine came from Scotland, where a device had been used for centuries before, and it had taken the heads of hundreds of people. But what is the story of the Scottish Maiden? Join us today as we look at this and assess whether it was one of history's most brutal execution methods. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The Maiden was an execution device which was used in Scotland between the 1500s and 1700s, mostly in Edinburgh. It was a device which was introduced in 1564 during the reign of Mary Queen of Scots, and its final use was in 1716. It was a device which came a long time before the guillotine, and the Maiden was built in Edinburgh and was made of oak, and on it was a lead weight and also an iron blade. Machines like this were not new, and there were other examples in Britain, for example the Halifax gibbet. By 1563 in Scotland, the sword which was used for executions in the capital was worn out, and then money was used to pay for the loan of a sword for beheadings. So the Scots, when they wanted to execute someone using sword, would pay to borrow an executioner's sword to perform the job, rather than to simply make their own. But after this, the provosts and magistrates of Edinburgh conceived the idea of the Maiden, and it was constructed to become a reliable and cheap method of execution. The original Maiden was made by Adam and Patrick Shang and George Todd. A blacksmith, Andrew Gotterson, added the lead weight on the blade after the other men had made the frame. They were paid for their work, and Shang was interestingly the maker of some of the royal furniture. But the time then came for the first execution using the Maiden. The first life and head claimed by the device was that of Thomas Scott of Cambus Michael, who made his way to the device in Edinburgh on the 3rd of April 1565. There were funds allocated for moving the parts of the Maiden from Blackfriars in Edinburgh to the town's cross, where the execution would be carried out. The different parts could be collapsed easily and then dismantled for storage when the time came around, but the executions using the Maiden took place at the Mercat Cross in Edinburgh, and also on Castle Hill and the Grassmarket near to Edinburgh Castle. The device could be lent and moved, and this happened in 1591, when Leaf needed the device to execute William Gibson. But one of the most high-profile victims of the Maiden was the regent James Douglas IV, Earl of Morton, who helped to rule the country during the minority of King James VI. Douglas had fallen from grace, and he was then taken to Edinburgh for his execution on the 30th of May 1581. He was kept on the Royal Mile, 100 metres from the Maiden and his execution site, and he would be executed 3 days later. The blade of the Maiden fell and took Douglas's head clean off, and it was said to have been clean work, but following his death his corpse was left at the foot of the Maiden on the scaffold for a day to act as a warning. His head was placed on a spike high above Edinburgh. Some historians have claimed that it was the 4th Earl of Morton who brought the device to Scotland, having seen it work in a similar way in Yorkshire with the Halifax gibbet in operation, taking the heads of serious criminals, yet he would lose his head on the device. In its time in operation, which was roughly a century and a half, over 150 people were executed on the Maiden. Archibald Campbell, the first Marquess of Argyll, lost his head on it, as did his son who shared the same name as him. They are probably the only father and son combination to lose their heads on the same device, but both were executed for being rebellious. The last execution on the Maiden took place on the 30th of June 1716, and John Hamilton was beheaded on it as he was convicted of murdering a pub owner. Following this execution, the Maiden was then stored away, and it can still be seen today. But the way the Maiden worked was similar to the guillotine. The executed person would place their head on the crossbar of the device, which was around 4 feet from the bottom. Then lead weights were attached to the axe blade. The blade would be guided through grooves cut from the frame. A peg was attached to a cord, and this kept the blade locked in place before the executioner would decide when it was time for the execution to take place, and then he would take out the peg, and this would cause the blade to fall and take the head off the condemned. Shockingly, sometimes, if a criminal was linked to animal theft, the executioners would attach the animal to the cord, and when they were driven off, the blade would fall. But the Maiden was an execution device which would inspire the guillotine in France, which would take the lives of thousands. The guillotine and the Maiden had a number of similarities, including the frame, and also the way the blade fell and took the head clean off. But the guillotine would be a device which would take the heads of the French King Louis XVI and his Queen Marie Antoinette, as well as many different politicians and key figures. But the Scots would get rid of the Maiden in the early 18th century, but the specific device of the Edinburgh Maiden would take over 100 people's lives, and their heads would be placed high above the castle and in other structures and gates around the Scottish capital. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.